Happy rainy afternoon. So we've had a couple of really nice days. I guess it's time. I hope that you're all well. That's the situation in the greater Philadelphia area for those outside. I don't know what your weather is like. If you're in Arizona, in Flagstaff, where our child lives, our son lives, you've had about 140 inches of snow. So who knows? We begin a new book this week in our Torah cycle of readings, Parshat VaYikra, and I've entitled this talk, Karbanot and Closing the Gap. This week, as we come together, we begin the third book of our Torah, Sefer VaYikra. I've always found it so interesting, curious actually, as a Jewish educator, that this book, that includes so many difficult passages and enough dry laws to excite any exacting and practicing lawyer, used to be the first book of the Torah that young children would learn. This is a far cry from beginning with our creation murals, flood stories, family plays, and most are about how we are supposed to treat our siblings and resolve arguments in more respectable ways than we see in the families of Bereshit. So why is this the case? Why was this the first book that was taught? For those of us who grew up in the age of Aquarius, we think of so many former generations as the age of discipline. You will do this, you will not do that, or else. Definitely not the preferred way to start our children's learning journey. We're the time out generation. We prefer honey on the letters, so to speak, to evoke another time-honored practice of beginning our children's education. Nonetheless, here we are, with what some may feel are just too many laborious details about the sacrifices our ancestors offered. So why do we keep reading these details in our Torah readings, in our prayers, in our holiday observances, and learn about them in our Gemara learning and other academic pursuits? Is there another set of lessons here behind and underneath the words as we now know I look? Nonetheless, as you know by now, one of my favorite go-to authorities when I confront questions like this is Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, Zichrono L'Shalom, who teaches as follows. Among the simplest yet most profound messages about the sacrifices and VaYikra was the comment made by Rebbe Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the first Rebbe of Lubavitch. He noticed a grammatical oddity about the second line of this week's Sedra. Daber al b'nei Yisrael v'amart alehem, Adam ki yakriv mikem. We'll keep coming back to that phrase. Ladoshem min ha'behema min ha'bakar u'min ha'tzon takrivu et korbanchem. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when one of you offers a sacrifice to the Lord, the sacrifice must be taken by the cattle from the cattle or the sheep or the goats. Or, teaches Rabbi Ladi, so the verse would read if it were constructed according to the normal rules of grammar. However, in Hebrew, the word order of the sentence is strange and unexpected. We would expect to read, Adam mikem ki yakriv, when one of you offers a sacrifice. Instead, it says, Adam ki yakriv mikem. Again, notice Adam, singular, mikem, you, plural, all that you are. When one offers a sacrifice of you, or as we like to say, Yah. The essence of sacrifice, says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, is that we offer ourselves. We bring to God our facilities, our faculties, our energies, our thoughts, our emotions. The physical form of sacrifice, an animal offered on the altar, is only, yes, you guessed it, an external manifestation of an inner act. The real sacrifice is mikem, from you, from all that you are and from all of you. We give God something of ourselves. Once again, here we have multiple levels of meaning and symbolism that are acting simultaneously on parallel planes. At no point is the person what is being offered and God disengaged from each other, but rather the person, what they're offering, God, is brought together in a unified synchronism. Think about this in terms of our prayers, the substitution for our Karbanot, still intended to bring all elements of this equation close and to unite as one. Consider the implications for our community in which we bring together so many different people who collectively create something so powerful when we gather. Returning to Rabbi Sachs. So let us consider the following. In sacrifice, what is it that we give to God? The Jewish mystics, among them Rabbi Shneur Zalman, spoke about two souls that each of us have. The animal soul, nefesh habehemot, and the godly soul, the nefesh betochenu. On the one hand, we are physical beings. We are parts of nature. We have physical needs, food, drink, shelter. We are born. We live, we die. As Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, puts it, man's fate is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so the other dies. Both have the need for breath. The human has an advantage over the animal, has no advantage over the animal in this. Everything is a mere fleeting breath. Havel Havalim. In our Karbanot, we are bringing together all elements of our existence, mikem, from all of you, from all that you are, from all of your faculties. I believe that Rabbi Sachs is suggesting here that within the legacy of the sacrifices, as much as so much else, as it is with so much else in Jewish practice, we continue to consider who we are in terms of being part of the earth, as well as being that special creation fashioned exclusively by God, as explained in Bereshit, Parak Bet, Pasuk Zayin, chapter 2, verse 7. VaYitzar Hashem Elokim et Adam afar min ha'adama, VaYipak ba'apiv nishmat chayim, VaYihi Adam l'nefesh chaya. And God created, and both names of God are used here, whereas in most of creation it's one or the other, but here it's both. God of justice, God of discipline. All of God is creating you, and then from all of you, you give back to God. Think about that. All that God is created the human being, the earthling, dust from the ground, and breathed into the nose of the human being life. VaYihi Adam l'nefesh chaya. And at this point, this earthling becomes a nefesh chaya, a breathing soul. Whether or not we are fleeting, as Kohelet came to believe, will depend on the intentionality of our actions. Why do we do what we do? Is it what we do important in and of itself? Or is there something else going on here that motivates the action? As God makes it quite clear through the voices of our many prophets of social justice, God comes to hate the sacrifices that are brought to God if the actions of the people who bring them do not match in intentionality. We are to be as compassionate and caring as Rahmanah, the compassionate one of God's names, concerned both with the breath, B-R-E-A-T-H, and breadth, B-R-E-A-D-T-H, of humanity, mikem, all that we are. And only then do our prayers, our sacrifices, our worship achieve their intended purpose. I would like to suggest that it is in this context that we come to learn and read VaYikra. Yes, we are talking about Karbanot, but let's focus on Adam ki yakriv mikem, the earthling that will bring all that you are, Korban Ladoshem, in your Korban, in your sacrifice, in your giving that closes the gap to God. Nechama Leibowitz teaches as follows. The sacrificial laws are like a sealed book. We comprehend neither their basic meaning nor their purport of their rules and regulations. Indeed, their lapse since the destruction of the temple may have blunted our feelings for the sacrifices. We shall endeavor to understand the views of some of our sages and commentators, therefore, on the underlying meaning of these sacrifices. Let us begin, Nehemiah continues, with the great controversy between Maimonides and Nachmanides on the subject. Maimonides deals with the meaning of the sacrifices in his Guide for the Perplexed. In Part 3, Chapter 32, he explains, "It is impossible to go suddenly from one extreme to the other. The nature of the human being will not allow them suddenly to discontinue everything to which they have become accustomed. Now God sent Moshe to make the Israelites a kingdom of priests, Mamlechet Kohanim, and a holy nation, Goy Kadosh, by means of the knowledge of God. Know therefore this day and consider it in your heart that the Lord is God. The Israelites are commanded to devote themselves to God's service and serve God with all of our hearts." Mikem, all of you, all of us. As evidenced through the narratives of Bereshit and Shemot, with Rachel's Dudaim and the Egel HaZahav, just to mention a few examples, it must be noted that this new affirmation is in contrast to the general mode of worship in which the Israelites were still familiar from their nascent days, which had too often been more about the cultic practice, the actual sacrifice, than the kavanah, the motivating intention. We are taught here that God understood this and acted accordingly, showing compassion and patience while moving the Bnei Yisrael along in the trajectory of their collective growth and maturation process. Nehemiah continues to quote Rambam Maimonides. "It was in accordance with the wisdom and plan of God, as displayed in the whole creation, that God did not command us to give up and discontinue all these modes of worship. For to obey such a commandment would have been contrary to the nature of the human being, who generally clings to what they are used to. It would in those days have made the same impression as a prophet would make at present if he called us to the service of God and told us God's name, and that in God's name we should no longer pray, we should not fast, we should not seek God's help in times of trouble, and that we should serve God in thought only, not by any action. For this reason, God allows these thoughts and these rituals and these actions to continue. By this divine plan of structured and dictated sacrifice, the traces of idolatry were intended to be blotted out, and the truly great principle of our faith, the existence and unity of God and our connection to God with all of us, kulanu, mikem, was firmly established. In other words, if things or animals or resources were to represent somehow the connection between God and an individual and the people in a symbolic way, then these practices could be adopted and adapted. Thus, the very strict details are provided to ensure that we are clear about what is happening here. The meaning of the sacrifice of the Karbanot is in the intentionality, in the intentional following of the directions that God gives. For that reason, the preparation, the hachana, and the steps of action, the ma'aseh, to be taken are specifically dictated. However, as we know, unfortunately, this did not work quite as planned. In recognition of this, Nehemiah continues to quote the continued discussion of Rambam, as he shows that the fundamental principle underlying all intended Jewish worship was still problematic in the time of the Nevi'im. Accordingly, teaches Rambam, the prophets frequently reprove their fellow men for being overzealous and exerting themselves too much in bringing sacrifices. That is, reverting to their historically known practices, not necessarily accompanying them with any required intentionality. The prophets therefore proclaim that sacrifices were not essential and that God did not require them. Shmuel says, "Has the Lord as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Shmuel Aleph, chapter 15, verse 22. Isaiah exclaimed, "To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices to me?" Chapter 1, verse 11. And as we know, and we go through all of the Nevi'im, this theme is powerful, often repeated, and often the subject of great vexation. If these sacrifices are Karbanot, are meant to bring us closer to God, and by association our prayers today are tefillot, and we do not give all of us, mikem, mimenu, all of us, we do not act in a way consistent with the standards of humanity, giving and understanding our accountability to God in our daily actions towards each other, then what good are they? Whether they are prayers or whether they are sacrifices. This was precisely the complaint and the accusation of our Nevi'im Achronim, our prophets of social justice. Nechama then goes and contrasts this teaching from Rambam about proper intent and accompanying action with what Ramban, Nachmanides, teaches regarding this aspect of religious praxis. And remember, they are a little bit apart, Ramban coming after Rambam in terms of going from the 11th to the 12th centuries of our era. Ramban teaches, seeing that human conduct is expressed in thought, speech, and action, God instituted that a person who has committed a transgression and offers a sacrifice shall place their hands on it, symbolizing the deed, making a confession as a reminder of the misused power of speech, and burn with fire the bowels and the kidneys, which are the organs of thought and lust, and the legs, symbol of the human hands and feet, instruments which serve the human being in all of our activities. The blood was then sprinkled on the altar, representing his life blood. All this should make the individual offering the sacrifice realize that having sinned against God with his body and soul, he would deserve to have his own blood spilled and his body burned. However, God, in God's infinite mercy, accepts this substitute for an atonement, and its blood in lieu of his, its main organs in place of his, the portions of the sacrifice eaten by the priests, so as to sustain the teachers of Torah, that they may pray for the person who has committed the misdeed. Accordingly, the daily sacrifice is offered up because the masses who are constantly caught up in the web of sin need them for expiation. In other words, Nachmanides looks at the sacrifices as actual and visceral expression of expiation, while Maimonides looks to the inner meaning that will eventually permeate the people and render the need for sacrifices unnecessary once they can no longer be offered, while their intentionality of proper actions remains intact. Both of these meanings are amplified in the Gemara, in Masachet Chagiga, in which there are very specific explanations of every detail of these sacrifices, including, for example, how one places their hands on the sacrifice, which comes directly out of this week's reading. V'samach yado al rosh ha'olev v'nitzala lechaper alav. And he will lean his hand, he will put his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted to make atonement for him. Note the exactitude with which all members of the community, learned and not so learned, were trusted to be meticulous with the details of the offering so that all could benefit. It is also interesting that as a parallel theme, the discussion in Masachet Chagiga moves toward the inclusion of as many members of the community as possible. for reasons that range from obligation, chiyuv, to nachat ruach, or feeling the joy and the emotional satisfaction of doing a mitzvah, in spite of the exclusions indicated in the beginning on 2a. While the beginning of this Masechet excludes practically all members of the Kehillah from the obligation of performing this act of sacrifice due to various factors including gender, physical features, ability of understanding, and so much else, it is acknowledged as the discussion of the details of the sacrifice are explicated that there is no purpose to the gathering itself if everyone cannot be included. This reframing of community should cause us all to step back and ask ourselves, what are we doing in terms of truly understanding the meaning of Karbanot and what they are to elicit from us? These discussions bring us closer to the meaning and purpose of the sacrifices instead of distancing us from them for fear of the volume of details. In other words, as God intends to include and validate all to the best possible degree, humans who do anything less in our communities are totally missing the point of Karbanot on all levels. Here we see that God is being patient with the Israelites and acknowledging that it will take a long time to let go of old habits of sacrificing from things and embrace this hoped-for intentionality of action and inclusion of giving from oneself. And similarly, here we are in our shared community, hoping for a change in our time, when all members of our community and our future generations will be accepted for who they are and included in our community in every way that is possible and reasonable, embracing and participating in as many mitzvot as each one is able. Mikem, all of you. As we consider this hope, we share as participants in our respective communities, we see, in the words of Rabbi Sachs, that we are dealing with the juxtaposition of our earthly soul and our soul from above in this dialectic, while giving of ourselves to the task at hand, including attending to the details of how we interact with and validate each other. Mitzvot ben Adam l'chaveiro, to the same degree that we give of ourselves to God. Mitzvot ben Adam l'makom. Nechama Leibowitz and Maimonides teach us that change cannot happen too fast, and we must be patient, following necessary transitional steps, while ensuring that our external acts are representative and evolve from our internal motivations. Nachmanides shows us how visceral and literal our involvement in what we do can be. As we look around at our way too fractured world and the increased physical expressions of outward religious identity and consider what is so broken in our interactions with each other on the most basic of human levels, we must reevaluate what we're doing and remember that the Jewish way is to give of ourselves, all of ourselves, mikem, give from all of you in an intentional way. This is the way of Karbanot. This is the way it is intended that we live today. Now back to our question in the beginning. Why do we think that this was traditionally, for so many years, the first book taught to children? I recently had a conversation with a friend and former colleague about culture and discipline of children. Why is it, for example, that too often the very schools where one would expect children to act with kindness and care because it is so central to the teachings of that culture and religion, this is not the case? Are we assuming something? Are we giving of ourselves and showing our children how to be? Are we using all that you are? Mikem, not just giving them more stuff? Here, I think, is the reason. Everything we do, everything we put out there comes from within ourselves. Adam ki yakriv mikem, korban ladoshem. It can only be a korban, that symbolic thing that closes the gap, that brings us closer to God, if we bring all of us to the table. This is the lesson of VaYikra. By doing the correct things and by following the dictates of the Karbanot, we will achieve the goal of bringing God, ourselves, and all we do together. Karbanot is about coming near. The Hebrew sheresh root, kuf, resh, vet. Not giving something up when we think of the word sacrifice. That's why I'm always very hesitant and need to make all these disclaimers and qualifiers when we translate one word to another language, because it reflects the value system of that language. Sacrifice has this sense of giving up. Korban is about coming closer. By letting go of something, we remove obstacles, if you think about it that way. As we continue to consider this and come to new appreciations of the many different people in our world and our actions towards them, and bringing all of us, mikem, mimenu, all of us, together in the way God wants, may we be guided to act as Rahmanah, the name we give to God as the compassionate one, in recognizing that changes take time while we hold on to the details and lessons of our past. And let us simultaneously, while holding on to that past, accept the new realities, the challenges our future has to offer us, and use those lessons to forge our way. Shabbat Shalom. Lehitraat.